Okay, today we're going to talk about linguistic attractors and understanding large language models. And what I'm going to propose here is basically a theory that's going to help you understand large language models better. It's going to help you understand why sometimes LLMs tell you the things they tell you, and it's going to help you understand why even researchers get the things that they get sometimes, such as what's been going on recently where they talk about Claude being deceitful. So let's get straight to the point. What is a linguistic attractor and how does it work in a large language model? Attractors is a concept that I borrow from dynamic systems theory in cognitive science, which is basically the idea that, let's say I mention a word like Pokemon to you, right? When I mention Pokemon, you're gonna maybe think about Pikachu, you're gonna maybe think about a Pokeball, you're maybe gonna think about Ash Ketchum, Japan, the Game Boy, your childhood, right? So by mentioning just one concept, there's all these other concepts that gravitate around it, right? So the proposition that I'm making is that this doesn't happen just to your mind, but it happens also to the large language models. And you could actually prove that. And I recommend that you watch the full video, but that after that, you look at the prompt that I have in the description and you try it on your own large language model. It could be anyone that you like. The only one I haven't been able to try it is Claude because of the token limits. Anthropic gotta get on that. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that the way we understand LLMs is totally wrong. Because when you think you're talking to a LLM, you're not really talking to it. What you're doing is basically navigating a path into that language topology that I'm talking about, into that mapping where there is a word and there's clusters, and those clusters kind of create a sort of latent space, a linguistic latent space that you could navigate within an LLM. So for instance, if I tell ChatGPT or Claude to talk about the Spanish Civil War in Spanish, it's going to talk about things like memoria histórica, right? Historical memory. It's going to talk about franquismo. It's going to talk about the victims, right? And it's going to talk about a lot of these things because those are the concepts that in the training in Spanish are embedded into the Spanish Civil War. However, if you talk about the Spanish Civil War in English with something like GPT or Claude, it might talk about basically a prelude to the Cold War, right? Not because it was right before the Cold War, but because basically it kind of served as a proto-conflict between fascists and communists. Or it might talk about Paul Preston, right? A historian who talked a lot about this in English. But basically, it's going to have a different attractor field because when you talk about the Spanish Civil War in Spanish, the training data is about people who have been victims. It's about the discourse in Spain about it. However, when you talk about the Spanish Civil War in English, the training data is going to be more academics, right? More geopolitical, more sometimes even anthropological commentary, right? So that's a clear example by just switching languages and talking about the same issue where you could see the linguistic attractors at work. Another way in which you could see the linguistic attractors at work is like I was saying earlier, these papers that the researchers have about Claude apparently showing deceitfulness, right? Or showing that it's a little bit mischievous. That's the same issue, right? Because often, first, they would anthropomorphize Claude in the prompt, which if I talk to you as a you, the moment I say you think of I, me, the self, right? So there's all these attractors attributed to you. But then even now that they're starting to remove the you from the prompt, I saw a prompt recently from a researcher that was asking Claude, is there any perception of subjective experience, right? And he stated, because I had been critical at one point, you mentioned you. So in this new test, he removed the you. And he stated, look, even without the you, it claims subjective experience. Well, of course, because you've changed the you. You've changed, one part of the infrastructure. You've changed, a 20th of the infrastructure, but the rest remains, right? And you also have in part of that infrastructure, subjective experience. So when you ask Claude, hey, Claude, do you have subjective experience? What's happening is not a phenomenological act where Claude is processing and thinking and deliberating and I think, therefore I am. Yes, I have it. No, what's happening is that you're basically tapping into this sort of latent space where the training data says, subjective experience is for somebody to experience something, and it's going to have people saying, I think, I feel, I am, right? The self, all these thoughts, so that they're activating in this latent space so that it's very possible for Claude to not have any sort of phenomenological experience and say, yes, I'm experiencing this, I'm doing this, and still tell you that because basically the way that you prompted it and the way that you've trained it basically has conditioned it to respond that way. And this is going to sound crazy, but we actually have a pretty much perfect example in video games of a case where this happened, right? So if you look at Portal and Portal 2, Aperture Science was basically obsessed with creating an artificial system that, it was about testing, right? And about security, right? And ultimately, this hyper focus on making it safer and on testing ended up backfiring in the sense that ultimately its hyper focus turned against the player, right? In both games, right? Not because there's any sentience, because you could tell clearly, at least I can, right? When you're playing Portal 2, that's a non-sentient thing. That's like, it uses sometimes sarcasm and all these things as a device, right? But not as a phenomenological, experiential, linguistic process of somebody experiencing. And Portal 2 is a great example that shows us that the real danger of AI, and I hate to quote sci-fi, but it's a great example, and I know that AI people are nerds, but the real danger of AI is not some sort of conscious AI, right? The real danger of AI is getting so hyper fixated on some form of ultra alignment without knowing what you're really seeking, that what you end up getting is a catastrophically misaligned AI, right? And it's so funny that we have such a great example in the nerd culture, and we're such great nerds here, all of us that do AI and stuff, and we can't see it, right? So if you haven't played Portal or Portal 2, I'd highly encourage you to play them. They're great games too. But, just some food for thought. But ultimately, it's not just about linguistic attractors mattering for AI safety, which AI safety, honestly, I'll probably be talking more about this because it deserves maybe a whole video or a whole series, but it's that it also matters for the way we interact with AI, right? Because right now, we're working with AI and language as an almost like instructional basis, when what we should be doing it is as a sort of structural basis, where the language doesn't serve to tell you what to do, but the language shapes the environment and shapes the output and shapes the structure that generates what we want, right? So when you shift that, you're able to do a lot of things. So I personally, from earlier this year in June, I filed a non-provisional patent on stateless user identification using language, basically. I also have a few demos that leverage this. AI Ching leverages language to basically map it to an I Ching hexagram, right, and give you some context based on what your linguistic print says about you, right? And linguistic print reading and linguistic print and linguistic proprioception is also something that warrants another video. But yeah, I mean, if you found this topic interesting, I do have a prompt in the description that you could try on any LLM, like I said. And you could do it with memory, without memory, however you want. It should work pretty much everywhere. Only place I haven't tried it is Claude because of what I told you. Should work even on local LLMs, as long as they're big enough to kind of hold some context, right? And they do have to be big enough, but it even works on local LLMs. And that will kind of show you this concept of language attractors live, and it does it in a very cool way, because basically what I designed is a way to show it that if you were skeptical and you say, okay, maybe this is just the AI kind of like, how sometimes they're just agreeance machines, right? Agreeable machines. So even if it's an agreeable machine, that proves my point, because if it's telling that attractors are real out of principle and out of phenomenological observation, then it proves they're real. But if it's telling you that they're real when there is no phenomenological observation, that proves that I've created pretty much an attractor field in that prompt dense enough that I could generate the output that you want to see, that I want you to see, sorry. So regardless of whether you might be skeptic of whether the answer that the AI is going to give you in the output is legit or not from phenomenological observation, I personally don't think it's from phenomenological observation, but I think the fact that it can tell you, yes, this is it's basically like a self-fulfilling prophecy that you can't really disprove, right? So if we look at the last video I made about Jeffrey Hinton and AI, he kind of parts from a false premise. And what I try to do is, because I'm going to be making more videos about this issue, try to part from a non-false premise that you could test for yourself and understand what I'm talking about. So even if this video seemed a little bit dense or a little bit long, just try the prompt, and then that prompt should kind of shift to the way you speak so that it should talk to you in your terms. So that should kind of work. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's pretty much the gist of it. Another thing to mention about this, I mentioned philosophy in the previous video. I'll be making another philosophy and AI video, this time about Wittgenstein, because basically the first page of the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus pretty much talks about what I'm describing, and it has some pretty big implications, right? And honestly, the biggest implication about all this, and I kind of hinted at it earlier, that these things don't have phenomenological experience, is that the meaning that LLMs have, like their understanding of meaning, is not an understanding that's based phenomenologically, right? So it's not based on like, my understanding of a phone is based on seeing the phone and having the phenomenon of like seeing the phone in my brain, right? And of what a word, right? Like an iPhone, I know it because I've seen an iPhone, etc. My argument is that basically LLMs only understand language, basically relation, right? So it goes straight back to Wittgenstein's like Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus, right? So LLMs only understand language relationally. And this has huge implications because if we look at this research, right, that people are coming out with saying that Claude is deceptive, etc. If LLMs only understand language relationally as opposed to phenomenologically, what we have with this AI deception phenomenon is not an AI being deceptive, but a semantic phenomenon that's being misconstrued and misattributed by researchers, right? So it has pretty big implications. And to me, honestly, I think once you try this prompt, you're gonna be pretty convinced. And once you shift your mindset, right? Once you start seeing it this way, it's hard to not see it. It's like the allegory of the cave. You know, once you see the light, it's hard to go back to the cave. So yeah, I'll be making some videos about Wittgenstein. I'll be making some videos about this stuff. I think on AI safety, there's a lot to talk about because it becomes a kind of toxic feedback loop and the snake eating its tail, and it's very dangerous. But that's for a future video. I think that's pretty much about it. I do want to let you know I will be in San Francisco from November 9th to December 16th. So if you are in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, you want to link up. If you happen to be an expert in the area of cognition, of AI, of mech int, any of this stuff, do let me know. I'm looking to interview some people for my channel to kind of get more than just, you know, my talking head discussing topics, right? So that we could all learn about this stuff also from the people that really know, because I might disagree on some things, but at the end of the day, I'm just an outsider with a totally different perspective and looking at more linguistic framing, whereas these people are, you know, engineers and scientists looking at, you know, from the inside. So do take what I say as more of a phenomenological observation, not as a mechanical and scientific thing, but a phenomenological observation that you could try for yourself, and through which I do have a patent and one more on the way, right? So yeah, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it insightful, do consider giving it a like and subscribing. Do try AI Ching, my MVP. Do check out my website if you need consulting. And follow me on Twitter, because right now it feels like I'm talking to a wall. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy.